Welcome to The Explainer. Sometimes history feels like a detective story. And today, we are diving into a real cold case. I'm talking 2,700 years old. It's this incredible story about a siege, an impossible siege, where you've got history, archaeology, and sacred texts, and they're all telling different stories. So what really happened?
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this, it's 701 BCE. The big player on the world stage is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And I mean, they are an absolute superpower under their king, Sennacherib. Their army, it's the stuff of legends and nightmares. We're talking brutal efficiency, cutting-edge siege technology, and a reputation for just completely crushing anyone who even thought about stepping out of line. Seriously, they were without a doubt the most feared military force on the entire planet.
And yet, when this supposedly unstoppable army marches on Jerusalem, the Hebrew Bible tells a completely different story. It describes this miraculous, overnight catastrophe. An angel of the Lord comes down and strikes 185,000 Assyrian soldiers dead. Just like that, the siege is over. It's this epic tale of divine intervention against, well, impossible odds.
But here's the thing, that's just one side of the coin. The Assyrian king himself, Sennacherib, he had his scribes write down his version of what went down. So what are we supposed to believe? Where does the truth actually lie? Was it a miracle? Or did something else, something totally different happen? Well, that's what we're here to do. Let's dig in and investigate the evidence.
All right, so first off, the core mystery here isn't if the invasion happened. That's not up for debate. Everyone, both sides agrees it went down. The real puzzle, the big question, is why? Why would the most powerful, most ruthless army in the world, seemingly on the verge of victory, just pack up its things and go home? It just doesn't add up.
Okay, so let's start with our first source. We'll look at the story as it's told in the Hebrew Bible. It offers a pretty clear and definitely dramatic explanation for what happened. The story itself is pretty straightforward. You've got Sennacherib's army invading and surrounding Jerusalem, demanding the city surrender. The king of Judah, Hezekiah, he doesn't know what to do, so he turns to God in prayer. Then the prophet Isaiah comes in with his message saying, "Don't worry, the city will not fall." And sure enough, that very same night, some kind of divine force just wipes out the Assyrian army. Sennacherib, totally humiliated, has no choice but to retreat. Now that phrase, angel of the Lord, is really key here. And it's not quite as simple as it sounds. Scholars and commentators, both way back then and today, point out that in the original Hebrew, this term doesn't just mean a winged being. It can mean any kind of devastating force that God uses as an instrument. So the cause might be seen as divine, but the method, well, that could have been something very earthly, like a sudden nasty plague that ripped through the army camp. A natural event that could totally explain a massive overnight catastrophe like this.
All right, let's switch gears and look at our second major source. We're going to leave Jerusalem for a minute and travel to the heart of the Assyrian Empire, to the capital, Nineveh, and see what the king himself had to say about all this.
So Sennacherib had all his great military victories recorded in what are called his annals. They were written down on these amazing clay prisms. And you have to understand, this was the official version of history. It's basically royal propaganda, right? The whole point was to show off how powerful and glorious the king was.
And boy, does he boast. In his version, Sennacherib claims he completely devastated the kingdom of Judah, conquering 46 of its cities. And King Hezekiah, he uses this really famous line, "Himself like a caged bird I shut up in Jerusalem." He then goes on to say that Hezekiah basically gave up, sending this huge tribute, gold, silver, ivory, even his own daughters, all the way to Nineveh just to beg for mercy. Okay, so let's just lay these two stories out, side by side. On one hand, the Bible says it was a total, miraculous victory for Judah. On the other hand, the Assyrian records claim a totally crushing victory for Assyria. Obviously, they can't both be 100% true. Which brings us right back to that big question. What really happened here?
But there's something really interesting about Sennacherib's victory story. See, Assyrian kings were obsessive record keepers. They bragged about every single city they conquered. But in this super detailed account, Sennacherib never actually says he captured Jerusalem. He says he trapped the king like a bird in a cage, but he never says he took the cage. And that little omission? Well, that's a massive clue.
And that brings us to our third line of evidence, archaeology. Let's move beyond the texts and see what the things they left behind, the stuff dug up from the ground and carved into palace walls, can tell us about this whole affair. So back in his fancy palace in Nineveh, Sennacherib decides to create this huge monument to his campaign in Judah, covering the walls with these massive stone carvings. But here's the weird part. The victory he chose to show off for all time wasn't Jerusalem. No, he dedicated an entire room to showing off his conquest of a city called Lachish, which was the second most important city in Judah.
And the inscription on these carvings is super clear. It literally says, "Sennacherib, king of the world, sat upon a throne and the booty of Lachish passed before him." It's all about Lachish. This was the big win he wanted everyone to remember. The fact that he focuses so much on Lachish and not Jerusalem is, well, it's incredibly telling, isn't it?
And get this, archaeologists have actually found the siege ramp the Assyrians built at Lachish. They've excavated it, and the engineering is just mind-blowing. They forced captive laborers to work 24/7 for almost a month, hauling stones to build this massive ramp so they could roll their 1-ton battering rams right up to the walls. It's just a terrifying testament to how relentless and powerful they were.
Just so you can get a sense of the scale here, we're talking about an estimated 20,000 tons of stone. An army that can pull that off, an army with that kind of determination and engineering skill, they don't just give up and go home. Something major, something catastrophic must have happened to make them abandon the main prize, Jerusalem.
Okay, so what happened to Sennacherib in the end? The biblical story seems to connect his retreat from Jerusalem directly to his death, but when we look at the historical records, the timeline gets a lot more complicated.
And this is a really important point to clear up. The siege of Jerusalem happened in 701 BCE. Sennacherib's assassination, that didn't happen right after, not even a year later. It happened in 681 BCE. That's a full 20-year gap. He went on to rule the most powerful empire in the world for 2 whole decades after that campaign in Judah.
Now the details of how he died, those aren't really in dispute. Both Assyrian and Babylonian records back up the biblical account on this one. He was murdered by 2 of his own sons while he was in a temple. It kicked off a big succession crisis, and another one of his sons, Esarhaddon, ended up taking the throne. So we know what happened to him. It's just that 20-year gap that separates it completely from the siege of Jerusalem. So where does that leave us? How do you make sense of all these conflicting pieces? Well, all these contradictions have led historians into this really fascinating debate. Are we looking at just one really messy, confusing campaign, or could there have been 2 separate invasions? Okay, so the one campaign theory basically tries to make everything fit into that 701 BCE event. The idea is that Sennacherib got a partial victory. He got the tribute money, but he just failed to capture the city itself. But then there's the 2 campaign theory, which is really interesting. It suggests that the biblical story is actually combining 2 different events. The first part, where Hezekiah pays the tribute, that's the 701 campaign, just like Sennacherib said. But the second part, the whole story about the angel and the army being wiped out, that, they say, describes a completely different, later invasion that we don't have Assyrian records for, one that ended in a total disaster for them. And this theory helps explain some weird things in the text, like the mention of an Egyptian king named Tirhakah, who wasn't actually king in 701. And really, this whole debate just shows you how tough ancient history can be. What we're left with are puzzle pieces, right? We've got broken texts, we've got royal propaganda, we've got religious stories, and all of them were written with their own specific agenda. Trying to build one single, objective story out of all that, sometimes it's just not possible. So after all that, what do we actually know? Let's break it down. We know for a fact Sennacherib invaded Judah in 701 BCE and conquered cities like Lachish. We also know he failed to take Jerusalem and eventually retreated. His own records practically admit that by what they don't say. But the reason for that retreat, well, that's still the big mystery. Was it a divine act? A devastating plague? A calculated strategic withdrawal? We just don't know for sure. What we're left with is a takeaway. The biblical account and the Assyrian account are 2 sides of a coin, each designed to send a message about power, one divine, the other imperial. And it leaves us with a final, really important question. How do we even write history when our best sources, our most reliable sources, tell completely different stories?